You know, when you hear the term foreign aid, what comes to mind? Probably charity, right? Disaster relief, helping people in need. But what if I told you that for decades, foreign aid was one of the most powerful weapons in a global war of ideas? Today, we're going to unpack how, during the Cold War, foreign aid was anything but simple charity. It was a tool, a strategy, and a weapon. To really get this, you have to picture the Cold War for what it was: a massive global geopolitical chess match. After World War II, you've got two new superpowers on the scene: the United States and the Soviet Union. And they weren't just in a military standoff. Nope, they were competing for influence on a global scale, trying to move their pieces and their ideologies into every single corner of the world. So you had these two opposing camps, and their worldviews couldn't have been more different. On one side, you have the United States and its allies, flying the flag for capitalism. Their main goal: contain the spread of communism at all costs. And on the other side, you've got the Soviet Union and its bloc, pushing for a worldwide revolution of the working class. These two visions for the world were just fundamentally incompatible, and that set the stage for everything that came next. So, how did this all start? Well, it begins with a world divided. The alliance that won World War II, it fell apart almost immediately, leaving this tense, new bipolar system with just two giants left standing. You have to imagine the atmosphere back then. It was just thick with suspicion. The US and its allies were terrified of Soviet domination in Europe. Meanwhile, the Soviets were dead set on controlling Eastern Europe to create a buffer zone against future attacks. And, of course, they were ideologically driven to spread communism. Each side saw the other as a genuine existential threat. And that created the perfect storm for a new kind of war. And in this new kind of war, where a direct, head-to-head military fight was just too terrifying to even consider, think nuclear annihilation, both sides had to get creative. They had to find other weapons, and one of the most effective, you guessed it, foreign aid. Now, there's a theory in international relations that actually explains this perfectly. It's called structural realism. I know, it sounds super academic, but stick with me because the idea is actually really simple. It basically says that in a world with no global government, no world police to keep order, every country is on its own. It's anarchy. And in that kind of system, the only rational goal is survival. And how do you survive? By becoming as powerful as you possibly can. So this is the realist playbook, and it really lays out the rules of the game. If the world is chaotic and your only goal is to maximize your own power, then things like foreign aid, well, they aren't about generosity anymore, are they? They're strategic moves. They're ways to gain influence, lock down allies, and weaken your opponent. And if you're a smaller nation, your survival often meant you had to pick a side. You had to align with one of the superpowers. All right, so that's the theory. But how did this actually play out on the ground? Let's take a look at the actual superpower aid strategies, because both the US and the USSR developed some very distinct ways of using aid to try and win this thing. In the beginning, the approaches were, well, pretty crude, to be honest. The Soviets, after 1953, would just rush in with these grand promises of aid whenever they saw an opening, but the follow-through was often not great. The US, on the other hand, used something called tied aid. Basically, they'd give you money, but you had to use it to buy American goods, or you had to supply the US with raw materials, often in ways that just so happened to be great for American corporations. But pretty quickly, the US moved beyond that. Things got a lot more sophisticated. In 1947, a diplomat named George F. Kennan laid out this new grand strategy. He called for a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This wasn't just reacting anymore. This was a long-term plan, a doctrine, to strategically block Soviet influence everywhere. And foreign aid was about to become the star player. And man, they did not waste any time. The speed and scale were just incredible. In 1947 alone, you get the Truman Doctrine, sending aid to Greece and Turkey to stop communist takeovers. Then the Marshall Plan, a staggering $12 billion to rebuild Western Europe, specifically to keep communist parties from gaining a foothold. By 1951, the Mutual Security Act basically made it official. Aid was now a formal part of U.S. national security. Now, this chart right here is really telling. It shows you exactly where the priorities were shifting. During the Marshall Plan, about a third of U.S. aid was military. Just a few years later, under President Eisenhower, that number jumps to about 50%. The focus was clearly moving away from just economic rebuilding and towards direct military support for allies on the front lines of the Cold War. And when you put the two models side by side, you really start to see why the US approach was just, well, more effective. A huge chunk of American aid, over 60%, came as grants, basically free money. The Soviets, mostly loans, and with worse terms. On top of that, the Soviet system was just bogged down by delays and backlogs, which made their aid a lot less reliable. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the superpowers, but let's flip the script for a second. What was it like for the countries caught in the middle of all this? For the newly independent nations in the global south, this whole thing was both a massive opportunity and a terrifying trap. This is what we call the recipient's dilemma. Right. What about the countries actually receiving all this aid? They were facing a really critical choice. Do you take the money and risk getting sucked into this global power struggle, or do you say no and risk getting left behind economically? It's not an easy call. You have to understand the promise was incredibly alluring. For a lot of these leaders, aid looked like a form of reparation for years of colonial exploitation. It was a chance to finally catch up with the developed world, to fund the industrialization they so desperately needed. And if you were clever, you could even play the US and the USSR against each other to get an even better deal. But, and this is a huge but, the price for accepting that aid was incredibly steep. It often meant losing your economic autonomy, being forced into these humiliating power dynamics with your donor. It meant getting dragged into the dangerous politics of the Cold War. Instead of building real independent development, it often just created a cycle of dependency. You became a pawn on someone else's chessboard. And that brings us to the next chapter in this story, a legacy of debt. Because as we head into the 1970s, the whole logic of this game starts to change again. The main reason capital was flowing to the global south shifted from political influence to something much, much simpler: profit. And wow, this chart just lays it out so clearly. In 1971, private money from banks and corporations was only about 17% of the financial flows to the South. By the end of the decade, it was 60%. Public, politically driven aid was being replaced by private, profit-seeking loans. The game had changed. So how did this happen? It was kind of a four-step process that created this debt trap. First, the motive shifted to profit. Second, big players like the World Bank stepped in as major lenders. Third, these new loans came with really strict strings attached, what they called conditionality, forcing countries to completely restructure their economies. And the end results? A new machine for exploitation that created what we now know as the Third World's debt crisis. And this new system? Well, it was brutally effective. As one of our sources puts it, the debt killed two birds with one stone. It let the wealthy nations in the North extract value through endless interest payments, and it made sure that the developing nations in the South could never become truly independent economic competitors. Which brings us right back to today, and to a really big, lingering question. The Cold War might be over, but a lot of these dynamics, the debt, the dependency, the strings attached, they're still around. It really makes you wonder, if foreign aid has so often been used as a tool of power, can it ever be a genuine path to independence? Can it ever truly lead to self-sufficiency? It's something worth thinking about.